Verse 44, we all know the text. No one is able to come to me unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him, and I will draw him, same him, raise him up on the last day or in the last day. And the reality is that a lot of my Reformed brothers who are maybe younger in holding this particular position, it's always important to remember that any quote-unquote proof text we use is probably going to be even stronger in its testimony when you know the text in its context. This is especially true in John chapter 6, because 644 does not just sit there, stand on its own. And when you see its relationship to the next verse, this greatly enhances our argumentation. Because when we talk about no one can come to me unless the Father sent me, draws him, and we emphasize the power of the Father to draw to the Son, what we need to see is that verse 45 then expands that definition and helps us to understand with greater clarity. So, verse 45, it is written in the prophets, and then you have the quotation, they shall all be taught of God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So, comes to me is a concept that was already mentioned all the way back up in verse 37. All the Father gives me will come to me. So, God's teaching, they shall all be taught of God. The passive actions of hearing and learning from the Father, these are all expansions and explanations of how the drawing of the Father works. No one has the ability in and of themselves to come to Christ unless the Father draws him. Well, how does the Father draw him? Well, verse 45 tells us there is teaching, there is hearing, there is learning. And mankind is so focused upon defending our autonomy and our abilities and our powers, that when we hear this, we take everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me, and we endow hearing and learning with autonomous capabilities, rather than recognizing these are passive things. People are taught by God. They hear. When I hear something, I'm not, I suppose I could hear myself talking, but in this context, everyone who has heard from the Father, you didn't produce that revelation. And yet mankind will go, yeah, but I had to hear. And of course, in John, we know hearing, seeing, these are words that John uses regularly. Remember John chapter 9? The one who can't see is the one who can see. The people who can see can't see. It's meant to be that way. John chapter 8, Jesus is going to say, why can't you hear me? Because you're not of God. So, hearing is passive. Learning is passive. It's taking in knowledge from another source. Being taught by God, passive. So, what do you have in verse 45? You have actions of God. God teaches, God speaks, he reveals knowledge, and we simply hear and learn. And everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So this is descriptive. We often ask questions. What does regeneration involve? What does it look like? We want real specific scientific answers, So Does the soul weigh a little bit more after regeneration? We want to get out our scales and our microscopes and stuff like that and be all scientific about it. But here you do have something that helps us to understand when it says the Father who sent me draws him. What's that drawing going to include? Well, we know that drawing is going to have certain results. And in this passage, they are infallible results. Everyone who's taught by God, everyone who's heard and learned from the Father comes to me. So this is a very specific, this isn't some general revelation. I mean, couldn't you argue on one level? Couldn't you say, well, everyone has learned from the Father because God created the universe, and therefore there's general revelation, and men know that God exists, but they suppress that knowledge, but still they've learned stuff, and so, but that's obviously not what Jesus is referring to. He's referring to a specific, salvific, effective, divine action. This is why you can go to John 10, and what's Jesus going to say? My sheep hear my voice. My sheep hear my voice. There is a personal relationship there. There has been truth about who Jesus is that has been communicated to that person who is now a sheep. But that sheep was chosen by the shepherd. The sheep didn't choose the shepherd. So the text is so clear in emphasizing the divine capacity, the divine power, that it is very, very educational to us to see how man will try to get around that and try to turn these texts into affirming human free will. But we've seen people do it. We've seen Norman Geisler do it. We've seen John Lennox do it. Smart folks, but so wedded to human autonomy that they'll actually see texts that are talking about divine autonomy in explicit terms and somehow find a way to turn them into texts teaching human autonomy. But don't forget, I think our conversations with others, when we go to John 6, and John 6 is an extremely useful and effective text to go to, our conversations will be greatly enhanced if we don't just stop at verse 44. But then we explain that verse 45 then helps us to understand better what this involves, what this drawing of the Father involves. It's effective. It accomplishes that which God intends it to accomplish. And the result of this communication of knowledge, in provisionism, remember, grace, as I understand how Leighton Flowers has expressed it, grace is found in the gospel. The gospel itself is gracious. God did not have to do what he did, but he did, so that's where the grace is found. That's why you don't need prevenient grace, is the grace is found in the gospel itself. Mankind has the capacity in and of itself. There's no udais dunatai in provisionism. Udais dunatai means no one is able. There's no udais dunatai in provisionism. Everyone has that capacity. Hence, the gospel comes, and there is knowledge of what Jesus claims, and it's up to the human individual to make the decision one way or the other, and then God acts based upon that, acts based upon his foreknowledge of what those human beings do. There's all sorts of theological problems with that, but that's the theory. Well, here's the problem. In John 6:45, everyone who is taught of God, everyone who hears the message, everyone who's learned from the Father comes to Christ. So, again, you're either a universalist or you're Reformed, because this communication of knowledge is effective. There is no one to whom the Father has revealed this knowledge that does not come to Christ. So the only two logical results from that is you either need to recognize the existence of the elect or you become a universalist. The autonomous choice just simply isn't there. It doesn't fit. So memorize verse 45 along with verse 44. Very, very important. But then, and this is what caused me to start thinking about all this. In a number of the references in the dissertation, you would have, if it was a direct reference John 6:65, there'd be a comparison to 6:44, or vice versa, or they both be cited together. And that's because they say so much of the same thing, but 65 is a summary statement later on, after the discussion of eating the flesh and drinking the blood, which is not a separate discussion. This is the other thing. If, for example, you have Roman Catholic relatives, friends, co-workers, whatever, you're not going to be able, I don't believe you're going to be able to address in a contextual, consistent format what Jesus is talking about when he talks about eating his flesh and drinking his blood until you see how that is related to what came before. Because what is in verses 37 and following, the high sovereignty of God, predestination, election, it's right there. That's the context of Jesus emphasizing his own centrality and what believing in him actually means, connecting it back to the Passover and the giving of the bread of life, etc., etc. If you don't see that everything that God does, like in verse 45, is so that his people come to Christ, and that eating his flesh and drinking his blood communicates to us his absolute centrality. We're not trying to join Jesus with a bunch of other things. That's what's so reprehensible about Union Theological Seminary and all, quote-unquote, inclusivistic deformations of the Christian faith. It's about Jesus. That's an exclusive claim. Try to add other stuff in there and you no longer have Christianity. When you are continuously coming to Christ, that's what you see in the supper. Because the supper, every time you partake of the supper, you're proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes, right? Proclaim the Lord's death in what context? That this is your only hope. That only by union with him, only by his death, only by his resurrection, only by his broken body and blood, do you have any hope at all. That's what was so horrible about the syncretistic religion in Israel when they would build the high places, the Asherim, the Baals, is because so many of these people would offer the sacrifices at the tabernacle or the temple and then go to the Baals. We frequently do the same thing now, not seeing the absolutely exclusivistic nature of the message of the gospel itself. So that becomes very important in looking at the rest of that. But I want you to see this right here. Udais dunatai elthine pros me. So no one is able to come pros me. Eon, unless, so we're in the subjunctive here. No one is able to come to me unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him. So eon me, conditional form. And so no one, dunatai, has the capacity, elthine, to come, pros me. And you may notice this little thing right here. That's just simply, there's a minor textual variant there where some manuscripts, specifically Vaticanus and a few other uncials, have a epsilon there. It changes. This is just in passing. This is one of those textual variants that has no impact on meaning, which is what the vast majority of textual variants are. That's just an alternate way of writing the direct object form of the pronoun here. And so some people did. So there was an epsilon in some and not another. That's all it is. But so many variants are exactly that. So do you see that? No one is able to come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Now, let's go down to the 665. So now, this is after, but there are some of you who do not believe, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who it was that would betray him. Now, there's all sorts of stuff. We could stop right there. We could say, does that fit into a provisionist understanding or a reformed understanding? Because, hey, it says he knew who would believe, so that's just simple divine foreknowledge. But could they have not believed? And what about Judas? Isn't the role of Judas prophesied? And is that just simply God looking down the corridors of time? Is that what prophecy is? Or does Judas is he not laid, he is set out as the son of perdition? Couldn't he have chosen to do otherwise? How do you answer that? Could he have chosen to do otherwise? Could he have invalidated divine prophecy? If you say that he has autonomous free will, you have a real hard time with this whole thing, because that's why open theists will actually say, well, that's right, he could have changed everything. Might not have been the cross. It might have been some other way that God had to do it. Anyway, so then you have in verse 65, and he was saying. Now, what's interesting here is this is the imperfect. And the imperfect is an interesting form in the original language. Syntactically, there are a couple ways it can be. There's inceptive imperfects and ingressive and continuous, and you start getting a little bit more of a subjective thing. Not subjunctive thing. That got really confusing. A subjective interpretation at that point. We start getting the syntax, but generally, what the imperfect is doing is talking about an action that was ongoing for a period of time in the past. It doesn't emphasize a start. It can, but it doesn't. That would be something that would be derived from the context, or maybe the verb that was being used, something like that. But the point is, in this instance, Jesus repeated himself. He had said it in verse 44. He says it. And then 65 tells us he was saying this more than once. In other words, we know that his teaching in the synagogue of Capernaum lasted longer than it takes to read John chapter 6, beginning at verse 35 or verse 30 or so. That doesn't take very long. So obviously, there were many, many, many more words spoken in that context. So what we're being told is that there was a emphasized or repeated element to Jesus' teaching. And that emphasized or repeated element was, for he was saying, dia tuta, for this reason, I said to you, he's pointing back to that first reference in verse 44. So the point is, Jesus himself teaches that he was repeating the emphasis that he made in verse 44. Sometimes we're told, you put too much emphasis on John 6:44. Well, Jesus did. Jesus repeated himself. So, for this reason, I said to you, then look at what comes in. That, udais, dunatai, Elthine, pros, me, aeon me. Look familiar? It's identical from verse 44. Identical. No one is able to come to me unless aeon me. And now here's where we get a little more light shed on the topic by having this repetition, this repeated element later on in the chapter, because the rest of the verse is different than what you have in verse 44. So, no one is able to come to me unless it has been given to him from the Father. So, can we learn something from the different way that John records these words? Because what's the difference? Well, here, unless it has been given to him by the Father, you go up to 44, And it says, unless the Father, the one who sent me, draws him. So, granting to someone, it has been given to him by the Father, and being drawn by the Father are the same thing. They're the same thing. So, granted to him, given to him, again, that's a divine act. It's a divine act. And yet, so many would try to tell us that that is a provisional act. That is an attempt on God's part. God is attempting to do something. So drawing in the synergistic concept is an attempt on God's part. He's trying to make something happen. He wants something to happen, but he can't necessarily accomplish it in and of himself. Or it's his purpose to simply make it, to provide it, provisionism, and then it's up to man. Right? So how do you understand that in light of the fact that 644 and 665 are meant to explicate each other? 665 adds the information that to be drawn by the Father, according to verse 44, if you're drawn by the Father, you'll be raised up on the last day by the Son. According to 665, you can't come to the Son unless it has been granted to you by the Father. If it's granted you by the Father, then you'll be given to the Son, and the Son will not lose you. The Father will draw you to the Son will raise you up on the last day. That's called election and predestination. That is personal. That's not some nameless, faceless group. This is the clear, consistent, I'm using the exact same exegetical methodology in looking at this that I use when looking at James chapter 2, which we did just last week, that I use in defending the deity of Christ in Colossians 1 and 2, that I use to defend the resurrection, that I use in responding to Bart Ehrman's claims that John has Jesus crucified on a different day. We're using the same exegetical methodology, which is why when we play the Radio Free Geneva theme, one of the sections in there is when I asked Leighton Flowers during our debate, are you using the same exegetical methodology to come to that conclusion that we would utilize in other texts of Scripture regarding the resurrection or things like that? Well, no. That's the end of the debate. When you say, well, no, Rich just, I don't think I've used one of these in forever. He just found one of these. He's going like this and the other. I surrender. It's done. That's right. That's how you do it in the debate. Is the other guy goes, so are you using a different way of interpreting Scripture now than you'd use anywhere else? And if you go, well, yeah. Okay, so do we have refreshments ready? yeah, that's right. Yep, that's right. And so seeing these things, seeing the parallel language, following the context, all of this stuff, it's just simply how you deal with the text of Scripture all the way through. And when you do that in John 6, you see that the Father is the one who draws based upon having that and that's to be understood as it has been granted to that person. And then when you tie that back together, 6:37-39, all the Father gives me will come to me. And I've not come down out of heaven to do my own will, the will of him who sent me, and this is the will of him who sent me, that of all that he has given to me, I lose nothing, but raise it up on the last day. 6:44, I'll raise it up in the last day. Wow, it's a consistent text. Powerfully consistent. And that's why when you listen to people trying to come up with a way around it, sometimes it's just painful. It is painful for me to listen to a brother who, if we were 2 chapters later, if we were literally only a couple dozen verses later in John chapter 8, and we're getting toward the end, the climax of John chapter 8, and the anger and the emotion is getting hot. And Jesus not only knows it, but he's pressing their buttons. And we look at that text, and many of my brothers, I'm thinking of some people right now, would walk lockstep with me through those verses that identify Jesus as Yahweh. Jesus as the I am. Put in Abraham Genesai, ego I me, before Abraham was, I am. And we'd use the same methods of exegesis to come to the conclusion that Jesus is the I am. But then when you apply the exact same methodology to John 6, all of a sudden things change. That's how strong tradition can be. That's how strong a commitment to some kind of human autonomy can be. That you can see it right there. The words are the same. It's consistent all the way through, but